expenditures, you will see that there is always a parallel drawn between the household budget and the government budget. And we had a Prime Minister in the mid-70s, just after the OPEC crisis, who came out on national TV to give an address, and he said, what the Australian public has to understand is that the federal government budget, and by now Bretton Woods has been abandoned, and we were running a floating exchange rate with a non-convertible currency. He said what the Australian public has to understand is that just like your budgets, our budget we have to have budget discipline just like you. Totally outrageous and wrong statement, but it's that intuition that makes the deficit terrorists, their message so powerful. Because people the public don't know how to argue against that, and it feels intuitive. But you won't find a definition of fiscal sustainability in that analogy. It's flawed at the most elemental level. The household uses the currency and always has to finance their spending, whether it's through earning income, whether it's through borrowing, whether it's through using up past savings or running down, selling assets. A national government who issues its own currency and floats it never has to do that. And a lot of people say to me, oh yeah, but you know, these public debt ratios are rising and the government is issuing debt. And what's happened is that governments have imposed, under political pressure, a series of voluntary constraints on their behaviour that really mimic the actual constraints that they faced under the convertible currency system. So my government in the mid-80s, the Australian government, explicitly changed policy such that the Australian government has to place debt into the private markets, dollar for dollar, to match its net spending. And at the time, if you read the historical documents, that you'll see it's all about the need for fiscal discipline, that we're unhappy with the option that the central bank might buy some of the debt that the government issued, more than it needs at that time, for liquidity management purposes. And what really needs to be exposed in this discussion are that all those constraints are voluntary. And in a fiat monetary system, the national government doesn't have to issue any debt at all. And so fiscal sustainability can't be caught, a pure concept of it can't be caught up and tied in with any of these voluntary constraints. And you know, most people don't understand the notion of a sovereign government. I don't know how many times I do quite a lot of media interviews in Australia on national TV and radio, and the question always comes out, oh yeah, but taxes are going to have to increase. That where's the government going to get the money from? The government's going to run out of money. There's no more money to spend. We've had such a fiscal intervention. We've run out of options. All of this sort of rhetoric, and that just tells me that we need to work harder in this debate to really educate the debate as to what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with governments in the main that issue their own currency, that issue it under monopoly conditions, and so the microeconomic rules of monopoly apply to that sort of government in terms of setting price or quantity, and that they can never be revenue constrained, even though it looks as though they are, because of these voluntary constraints that they erect as edifices to hide the fact that they are actually sovereign. And we need to get the message across in more vehemently that what that means is that our national governments can spend whatever they want. and has no imperative like a household to facilitate funding of that spending. And what looks like to be funding operations, this debt issuance, nothing of the sort. And that, what then emerges in a discussion of fiscal sustainability should be to really articulate what the limits of government spending are. And we were led to believe it's, oh, well, once debt ratios go above 80%, that's it. Or in Europe, once the deficits go above 3%, that's it. They're not limits at all. All of these financial ratios are not limits at all for a sovereign government. The limits are clear, that a sovereign government can only buy what's available for sale. They're real limits. If there's something out there available for sale, the government can always afford to buy it. A sovereign government. And when I look around and I see high unemployment and persistently high unemployment everywhere, then I know that there's at least one productive real resource that's available to be purchased. And that's the labour that has no bid for it in the private market. So that'd be a good place to start. And so when I see any unemployment, I know that the government has no real resource constraint yet. And this then leads to another component of the journey to understand what fiscal sustainability is, and that's understanding the nature of costs. When the government prints their budget statistics for the month or whenever the frequency is, and everyone goes, ooh, ah, look at that big figure in the piece of paper. It's getting bigger. It's gone above Rogoff's ratio. That's not a statement about cost at all. Numbers on bits of paper aren't costs. When my government next month's going to announce its budget austerity plan, and there'll be media attention about what the deficit ratio is and blah blah. They're not costs. When government spends $1 billion, $1 million, that's not the cost of the government program. The cost of the government program are the extra real resources that are required to implement and sustain it. So if you've got a jobs program, what's the real cost of that? It's not whether it's $500,000 or $10 billion, whatever. It's the extra food and the extra materials that the unemployed that you're going to bring into productive use utilise and consume. That's the cost. And when we're thinking about when we juxtapose the concept of fiscal sustainability in the public arena to what I think it is, then the public arena debate's all about financial costs, alleged financial costs, whereas I only think about it in terms of real costs. And then we have to understand the role of taxation. And my colleagues will talk about this in much more detail later. And, you know, the part of the hysteria is that very soon taxes are going to have to rise to pay the deficits back. And if they don't rise in the next 2 years, our poor children and their grandchildren, the poor little bastards, are going to be so burdened by our prolificacy that we should hang our heads in shame. That's the debate. Now, it's possible that taxes will rise in the future. It's possible they'll rise in the next 2 or 3 years. But if they do, it's also possible they could fall. But if they rise, it will have nothing to do with the funding requirements of our sovereign governments. The role of taxation in a counter-stabilising macroeconomic policy framework is to regulate aggregate demand growth. And so if aggregate demand, nominal demand, is growing too quickly for the real economy to absorb it, well, then there's a case to be made. If the political settlement is such that you want to have that much public access, command of real resources, then there's a case to be made that you'll want to increase taxes and reduce the purchasing power and therefore aggregate demand of your private sector. And so that's to regulate demand to avoid inflation. It's got nothing to do with funding.